Hey everyone, today I'm going to answer the question in my usual visual way about what happened to the Apostle Paul after Acts. This video is for those of you who love visual storytelling, love archaeology, love history, and love the Bible. So strap in and let's get to it. So the first thing about the Apostle Paul, for those of you guys that don't remember, is under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Paul wrote 13 books of the Bible, that whole green chunk on the screen right there. That is a lot of books. So he was one of the most prolific authors of the New Testament. And returning to this picture that we started with, I wanted to give you guys an idea of the history of Paul in a sense. So this particular image is the earliest visual picture of Paul, and as you guys know, I do have a bent for the visual. Now, this was found in 2008. There's this place in Rome called the Catacombs of Saint Thecla, and they used a laser technique to remove calcium from the walls, and underneath that layer they found early images, earlier than anything yet found, of the apostles and Paul. And so specifically with this one, this is a fresco, which means that color was embedded into the wall and pressed, and it has there's five classic features that you'll find in art of Paul, and this one has only two of them, but it's because it's just of his head. So I wanted to show you guys what the five classic features are, and we'll talk about some of these later, but the first one is receding hairline. Paul in early art is always shown with a receding hairline, so either going bald or all the way bald. And so you can see that here on the top. He's almost uncovered. Is usually shown with a pointy beard, and maybe that's a geometric thing, but in some ways his beard wasn't a square beard, it wasn't a round beard, it was a pointy beard. And then the three aspects of Paul in art that they don't necessarily show here is Paul was rumored to be short, so not necessarily a tall man. He's usually shown holding a scroll, which is a representative of the 13 books of the New Testament that he penned. And then lastly, he's holding a sword, which we'll talk about at the end of this. So that gives you an idea of Paul in art. And so as we look at some of this art, we'll see kind of some of that in the art that we're looking at. So the first thing to know about Paul is if you read Acts, Paul was initially against Christianity, against the way, against Jesus. And so this picture shows Paul right there watching people's coats as they performed the stoning of Stephen. And he really only changed until he didn't really change until he was traveling to Damascus to persecute believers. And as he was traveling there, he had an experience with Jesus. Jesus appeared to him in blinding light. He fell off his horse, and Jesus spoke to him. Other people saw the light, but they didn't hear Jesus. And Paul, from that point on, was blind. And so I love this painting because it shows the other people traveling with him seeing the light, but not being able to interpret or know what it's about. And it shows Paul being messed up by the experience, which he was. So after this, Paul went on 3 missionary journeys, and those 3 missionary journeys are contained in Acts. He wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he wrote Romans, and finally towards the end of Acts, and this is around chapter 21, I have the exact chapter on the next slide, he brings some Greek believers. Now when I say Greek believers, they were Greek Jews, but they dressed in a Greek style, and he brought them to the temple. And when they're in the temple, they're about here. And so Paul takes them and he does something with them that is very important, which is he crossed this little wall right there, and he brought them to this point right here. Now that little wall is called the Soreg, and the thing about the Soreg is that you were not supposed to bring anybody who was not Jewish, because the outside part's the court of the Gentiles, the inside part is for only Jewish people. You're not allowed to bring them past that wall. Now these guys were Jewish. The Bible tells us that they were Jewish. They were Greek Jews, but they were Jewish. So people looked at him, and there's probably some people that were already trying to get Paul in something. You know how oftentimes in public media, like a public figure, people try to find dirt on that person. They'll do whatever they can to find dirt on that person. And so they see Paul bringing these guys who look like Greeks across this wall, and they start inciting a crowd. These people get into an uproar. Now, the Romans had purposely kept a fortress right next to the temple that overlooked it. It's called the Antonia Fortress, and it's right here. Now, the Antonia Fortress, it was built before the time of Jesus, before the time of Paul, during what was the war that changed the Roman Empire from being a like a constant. That's not the right word. They had senators. They were led by the people to being an empire. Forgive me for blanking right there. But that's when this was built. It was built by Mark Antony, purposely to keep watch over everything in Jerusalem, and he put it here specifically for a purpose. And so the Romans could see what was going on. They could see the riot going on. They were allowed to go into the court of the Gentiles. So they break up the riot, and they pull Paul out. Now, what's crazy funny is, that temple doesn't exist anymore. Now the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim holy site, is upon the spot of it. But in the archaeological digging through of the stuff that the Muslims had dumped out, they found this sign. And these signs were supposedly set up on the Soreg ever so often. And this warning sign specifically says, do not bring Gentiles into the inner court of the temple. And so the part where Paul does what they think is in Acts 21. So it's just crazy that we have this piece of archaeology that so ties into the Bible and this issue in the Bible. So as I talked about, the Romans pull Paul away from it. He's now arrested. They partially arrest him to stop the riot, but also because they think, I don't know, maybe he had something to do with it, and it kind of has to get worked out a little bit. So Paul's in prison, and he's getting accusations really similar to Jesus, where you're getting these false accusations against him. And so Paul, through a process, begins to apply to higher and higher people. When he eventually applies to the emperor, because he's a Roman citizen, he can ask to be tried at higher levels and eventually the emperor. And so people are still trying to kill him. And so he even has to have a night escape with a bunch of guards as they take him to a place called Caesarea Maritima, which was a city on the coast that had been built in honor of Caesar Augustus. And it was basically the main port out of the land of Judea. So Paul gets taken there, and it's through that he begins to travel to Rome. And as he's traveling to Rome, you guys might remember the shipwreck that happens in Malta, which is up here. And then he reaches Italy, and he reaches Rome. And the Bible stops there. The Acts ends in Acts 28, and it ends Paul's story there. So what happened to him afterwards? Well, we know some of it because some of his letters were written afterwards. Paul is under house arrest, and yeah, this is a horrible piece of foggy art, and it's a little bit old. I don't know of any other versions of it anywhere on the web, and I haven't found any in any of my picture sets. So basically, Paul is chained to this table, but it's a relatively nice imprisonment. He's in this house imprisonment. There's a guard with him. And he writes Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and the situation that happened with Philemon was why he was in this house imprisonment. Now, eventually, he gets released. And it's believed, partially because some references in Romans, that he went to Spain and on a fourth missionary trip. Now, there is no direct writings about that are canonical. There is a little bit of stuff that's not trusted. So he goes to Spain. Now, when he gets done, there's a situation brewing back in Rome, which is, Nero's kind of begun to go crazy. And so the first thing, he has begun to hate Christians. And so in this horrible painting that you're looking at here, we have a bunch of Christians tied to stakes, and they're about to light them on fire for Nero's garden parties, which is something that it said that he did. So basically, he would use Christians burning alive to light his parties. So the guy is, quite frankly, a monster. Now, there's a certain point where he wants to upgrade Rome. And the problem is there's a bunch of people living in this part that he wants to upgrade. So it's said that he planned this fire, and the fire broke out, got out of control, and he had to have a scapegoat for it, so he blamed the Christians for it. So after this, Paul's back from his missionary journey. Guards bust in, and they arrest him. And as they arrest him, they bring him, and they put him not in a nice house imprisonment like last time, but they put him in basically the equivalent of a dungeon. And so this cartoon from the Kingstone Bible, welcome to Rome's Maritime Hotel where I know all the rats by name. You look, Luke, you look distressed. What is it? So this is just a dramatization of this part. Well, how do we know anything about this part? Well, first, I want to show you something that's interesting, which is this prison that Paul was in, and this is very, very well attested by tradition, is this building right here. Now, this facade is new over it. This is not how it looked in Paul's time. Architecture was not the same in Paul's time. So this is the front of the Maritime Prison, also called the Telenium, if you want to visit it. You could go to Rome and you could see it. And so this specifically is where it's believed that Paul's imprisonment was. Now, it's crazy because Peter's imprisonment was believed to be in the same place, just not at the same time. So what you can see is they're lowered down from the top. That hole in the floor is actually a well. It goes down to water so that they could pull their own water out. The plaque on the back just says that this is the place that Paul was in prison. Very, very well attested in tradition that this is where he was. Now, it's rumored also that he wrote Titus, 1 Timothy, and 2 Timothy from this prison cell. 2 Timothy is the last thing he wrote. It's how we get most of the idea of how he felt as he came close to his ultimate execution. Now, how was Paul executed? Being a Roman citizen, he couldn't be crucified in the same way that Peter was, or the same way that Jesus was, or the same way that some of the other apostles were. That was reserved for people that were not citizens. If you were a citizen, you got a quick death. And so this painting by Enrique Samanet basically shows that Paul's beheading. He had his head cut off. Now, this was done outside of the city walls of Rome, on a place called the Ostian Way. It was a road outside of Rome. Now, when he had his head cut off, his body was gathered up, and it was placed in the catacombs where the Christians would worship, and it was stored there for around 350 years. At that point, though, Constantine the Great had converted to Christianity, and he wrecked a temple that was on the Ostian Way, and he built a church, and this is the modern version of that church. It's called St. Paul outside the walls. This is not how it originally looked. There was a big fire in 1823 that destroyed the whole thing. This is a rebuilt version. And so you'll notice now there's a statue of Paul right in front of this, and he has a double pointy beard in this one. You can't see the receding hairline because of the covering on his head, but you will notice that he is holding a scroll in one hand and a sword in the other hand, and the sword is because of the way that he died. And so this church that Constantine built, when he built it, they went and they pulled Paul's coffin out and they brought it here. Now, when I say his coffin, sarcophagus, it was basically a stone box. Now, for 1,600 years, it was believed that his sarcophagus was underneath the altar inside of this church. And nobody had checked, nobody knew for sure. And so finally the Vatican decided to investigate it. And so as they were investigating it, they found this dug out. So the altar is above this, right next to where this cardinal is standing. Underneath is a cleared off spot, and that spot is part of the place where they show the original foundations. But where the light is showing, back there's a white sarcophagus, and on the sarcophagus it had the inscription Paul Martyr on it. And so eventually the Vatican decided to drill into it. Well, what did they find when they drilled into it? They found purple cloth, which was expensive, embroidered with gold. They found incense, red incense, and they found bone fragments, and those bone fragments they tested, and they came back as coming from somebody who lived in the 1st century. So there is a lot of tradition that most likely this is the real remains of Paul that are underneath this. Eventually, I hope to go into some of the other apostles and what's happened to them over time. But it's just interesting to see the Bible's history put out because we have faith that a lot of these things are true, but they're grounded so much in a beautiful form of history as well. So, one of Paul's last lines in Second Timothy, and this is just very, very relevant to his life and death. He says, "If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. And if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." And I just think that's a very beautiful verse, because we have to remember Paul's life was not in vain. It is because of him partially that Christianity became a world religion. He worked so tirelessly to spread the gospel at danger to himself. Many attempts on his life, many times in prison. And the one thing that we also have to remember is the future eternal state. And what I mean by that is Paul lives, and we will live too with Jesus in eternity if we accept him. And that's the beauty of everything. Thanks for listening, and I appreciate you guys greatly. I hope that you enjoyed this romp, and I hope to do more of these over time.